Good morning. The Lord be with you. Let's begin with prayer. We ask for your guidance, God, as we study these two Psalms, Psalms which you gave us, not only for the time in which they were written, but for us today. May we learn from them and take hope from them. In your strong name we pray. Amen. So, Psalms 93 and 94. Psalm 93 is primarily a psalm about the kingship of Yahweh. Most of the translations read something like the Lord is king, but the Hebrew here says Yahweh reigns. It amounts to the same thing, but we don't really have the noun for king here. We have the verb. And so this psalm is about the reign of God, the rule of God as king. It says that as king, or as the one who rules, Yahweh is robed as a king would be expected to be, but this king is robed with qualities, two qualities, majesty and strength. He is robed in majesty, he is robed in strength. God as king from all eternity, notice, he has established the world, it shall never be moved. Your throne, that is the throne of Yahweh, is established from of old. You are from everlasting. We had a good discussion this morning about whether the psalm says that God becomes king because he has established the world as his kingdom, or whether God was already king and manifested his rule over all things by creating the world. And the commentaries I read took different points of view on this, saying that without a kingdom, you're not a king. You may exist, and God exists before all things, but God is only a king when God creates a kingdom to rule over. I think the point of the psalmist is that God always was, and always was robed with majesty and power. So in a sense, God was always king before there was anything to be king of. God's rule, God's being is everlasting. God's sovereignty is everlasting. And as a manifestation of his sovereignty, of his rule as king, he created the world and has now a kingdom, as it were, to rule over. Though in that sense, kingdom of God is not the way the New Testament necessarily uses that word, but it may be implied here in the psalm, in the way the psalmist thinks about God's rule and reign. It is an everlasting reign. God has established the world, and it shall never be moved. That's the end of verse 1. We had an interesting discussion about whether the world, in fact, is changing, and what it meant to the psalmist originally, that the world never would be moved. It shall never be shaken or never be moved. And we talked a little bit about climate change and about the idea that we may have passed the tipping point when we can turn around the change of the climate. And so the world as we know it is changing, and it is not changing for the better, as most of us who are members of this study group, wherever we live, are experiencing. The world, and the world our grandchildren will inherit, is not the same world that we were born into, and we have made it worse. But from the psalmist's point of view, as he looks at the moon and the stars which God has made, as he looks at the orderliness of creation, the regular passing of the seasons, the orderly movement of the planets in their courses, the regularity of the universe as the psalmist knew it, he could say all of that shows the unchanging nature of God, who is from everlasting and has created this order. Now, we then move to verses 3 and 4, which immediately jump into a threat to that created order, stability, dependability. And that's symbolized by the flood waters. In the ancient world, the floods, the waters of the sea, the ocean, the rivers, in their overflowing and flooding, represented the powers of chaos, the chaos that is able to destroy all things and to establish its own rule and power over all things. Floods almost always in the Old Testament symbolize these powers of chaos, and this goes back actually to the Babylonian myths of creation, in which there is a high god, a god of the skies, who defeats an equal partner, the god of the seas, and so the power of Yahweh here, of the Lord, is seen also as the power that has destroyed the powers of chaos in order to maintain an orderly world. And so the flood waters are lifted up against God. They are roaring and lifting up their voice. But God, who is robed in majesty and power and strength, God is more majestic than these threatening powers of the flood waters. God is more majestic. More majestic is God on high, who is the Lord. So he is able to defeat the powers of chaos. This may be also reflected in the creation story in Genesis 1, where the Spirit of God broods over the powers of chaos, the void and the formless chaos that God then establishes order on by saying, let there be light, let there be stars, let there be sun and moon, plants and animals and humans. God establishes an order over the chaotic powers of the formless void that is represented in Genesis. And that idea may be here as well, that God, in the face of the threats of the powers of chaos, establishes God's rule. Well, certainly today in many places in the world, people are faced with the powers of chaos, the powers of disorder, the powers of violence that threaten human life as we know it, powers of nature that are now out of control because of things that human beings have done to the planet. And yet, against those threats of chaos, which also appear to us as they did to the people of the ancient world, God is asserted to be the Lord, to be the one who rules and reigns even over the harm that humans have done to the planet. It doesn't mean that we won't have to pay the consequences of the evils that we have done in disregarding the beauty of this creation and its gift to us, in misusing it. It doesn't mean we won't have to pay the consequences for that, but it means that ultimately God's purpose for all things, God's good purpose for all things, will come to pass. And that's inherent in the reign of God and the rule of God. This Psalm 93, brief psalm, ends with a surprising verse. It seems out of context. All along we've been dealing with the reign of God and his victory over the powers of chaos, and then along comes a verse about church and rules, or decrees and the temple. Now, one of the members of the Monday study group had no problem with verse 5 because she thought that the decrees were the decrees of creation. God's let there be decrees. that God commanded by his word all things came into being. And so that the opening of verse 5 simply referred to the way God established God's kingly rule over all things by his decrees that brought order. And that the house wasn't the temple in Jerusalem, but the house is the created world where God dwells. That this is God's world, this is my Father's world, as the hymn says, and that God established God's rule over it through his decrees. And therefore the Lord is forevermore. The Lord is everlasting, and he is sure and dependable, as the world he created is sure and dependable, as his word is sure and dependable. Your decrees are very sure. Holiness befits your house, the sacredness of God and God's presence, O Lord, forevermore. So, Psalm 93, a psalm of the rule of God in the face of chaos and asserting God's rule and reign over all things, making a certain and dependable order that human beings can count on. A wonderful gift. We then come to a longer and more complicated psalm, Psalm 94. And as I read this psalm, it fell naturally for me into 5 sections. The first section being the calling forth of God to take care of the problem of wickedness and injustice. O Lord, you God of vengeance, you God of vengeance, shine forth, show yourself, manifest yourself as the God of vengeance. Rise up, O God, in your role as judge of the earth, and give to the proud what they deserve. How long, O Lord, shall the wicked, how long shall the wicked exult? There is a problem in the world. The arrogant and the proud are lording it over the rest of the world and doing injustice and causing suffering, and the opening verses call upon God to exercise God's vengeance. Now, for us, the word vengeance may have connotations that are not appropriate to how that term was used in the ancient world, and I want to share with you a definition or understanding of vengeance that's more appropriate to this passage from James Mays's commentary on the Psalms. The background of the use of the terms avenge or vengeance in Israel is not the emotion of a hate reaction, but it is in the sphere of legal custom. Vengeance was an act to enforce or restore justice when the regular processes of law were not competent or had failed. As an activity of Yahweh, as an activity of the Lord, vengeance was understood as a function of God's rule as king, as we saw in the previous psalm. Vengeance is understood as a legitimate function of the rule of God as king, God who has the right and responsibility to restore the order of things and to vindicate God's own authority. This function of vengeance is an aspect of the Lord's rule as judge over all the earth. And so when this psalm opens with a plea for the God of vengeance to act, it is really a plea for the Lord to vindicate his reign by intervening in the human situation in a time when wrong was rampant. I thought that was a helpful understanding of what is meant in this psalm by vengeance. And it's a call that God would continue to establish and reestablish the order in the face of the powers of chaos, which, like the floodwaters, have risen up to do injustice, to cause suffering. And in fact, the next verses 4 through 7 tell us what the suffering is that the psalmist sees, the chaos that he sees, that he wants God to act to restore the right way that things should be. This is a part of God's righteousness, right? God's fierce determination to put all things right. And that's what the psalmist calls for when he calls for God to be a God of vengeance. He wants the righteousness of God to act, to see, and to establish the restoration of all things according to God's will. And that's needed because, verses 4 through 7, because they, the arrogant and the wicked, pour out arrogant words and boast. Evildoers are boasting. Nothing is contradicting them. They are crushing the people of God. They are crushing your people, O Lord, and afflicting your heritage. In fact, they harm the weakest members of society. So cowardly are they in their actions that they prey upon the weakest members of society, the widow, the stranger, the immigrant. They murder orphans. They say, the Lord does not see, the God of Jacob does not perceive. Who cares? We can do whatever we want. There is no power stronger than we are. There is no God who is going to change anything or do anything to upset what we want to have happen. We will do what we want in order to get what we want. And that's the wickedness that the psalmist sees and describes here in verses 4 through 7. And it includes the idea on the part of these enemies that God doesn't care about what's happening in terms of evil in the world and suffering in the world. And the psalmist therefore causes God to rise up and defend God's self, to defend God's name and restore justice in a time of great evil and injustice. The psalmist then in verses 8 to 11, I think, in my interpretation, turns to these powers of evil, these powers of wickedness, and says to them, understand, O dullest of the peoples, you fools, when will you be wise? You think that God does not see, and the God of Jacob does not perceive. Verse 7, you think that, but has he who planted the eye, does he not hear? He who formed the ear, does he not hear? He who formed the eye, does he not see? In other words, God created the human ear and the human eye. Of course he hears. Of course God sees. He is the one who disciplines the nations. God who teaches knowledge to humankind. Does he not chastise those who do wrong? The Lord knows our thoughts, that they are but an empty breath. It seems to me that verses 8 through 11 are the psalmist's direct critique of those arrogant, boastful, wicked people who caused the suffering described in verses 4 through 7. And he addresses them and calls them to remember that they are wrong, that God does see and know, and therefore they are liable to God's judgment. He then turns to encourage the people who are suffering, to encourage the people of God, the people whom the powers of evil are crushing, according to verse 5. He turns to them and he says, happy are those whom you do discipline, O Lord, and whom you teach out of your law. That is God's own people. You give them respite from days of trouble until a pit is dug for the wicked. And that seems to me to be a key understanding, that the pit for the wicked has not yet been dug. And so God, the psalmist here, is offering this counsel for the interim period between when the promises of God will finally be enacted and the current suffering. There is some understanding here that God will act to bring about the restoration of all things, to bring about God's righteousness, that his fierce determination to put all things right will one day be revealed. But it hasn't happened yet. The pit yet hasn't been dug for the wicked. But we can take encouragement and know that God will give us respite even from days of trouble until this final eschatological judgment happens on the wicked. For the Lord will not forsake his people. He will not abandon his heritage, even though, back in verse 5, his heritage is afflicted and crushed. God will not forsake his people or abandon them in their suffering. The promise is that justice will return to the righteous, and eventually all the upright in heart will follow it. So there is hope here for the people of God, even though they do not yet see the final restoration and redemption of all things as they hope for. Finally, the last section of this psalm, the 5th section, is an affirmation of God's intervention and of God's restoration of justice. God will intervene. God will restore that which is threatened by these powers of chaos, who are the wicked, arrogant evildoers described in verses 4 through 7. Who rises up for me, the psalmist says in verse 16. Who rises up for me against the wicked? He himself expects to do what is right, and he also expects that he will do what he can against these wicked evildoers, but he needs an ally. Who will rise up for me against the wicked? Who stands up for me against evildoers? He is standing up, but he needs also someone to stand up and to rise up for him. And of course, that person is the Lord. If the Lord had not been my help when I was seeking to do what is right, and to protect the orphan and the widow and the stranger, if as I was doing my part to bring about justice and compassion and mercy, as it says in the book of Micah, that what the Lord requires of us is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. And the psalmist is doing that, but he needs an ally. And he says, if God had not been my help, I would have soon lived in the land of silence. In other words, that he would have died and gone to Sheol. The land of silence is the place of the dead. If God had not been his help, his efforts would have failed, and he would have died. And he almost thought that. He almost despaired. In verse 18, he says, when I thought, oh, my foot is slipping, I'm losing it here. I don't see any help for me. But then, at that moment, God's steadfast love held him up. Your steadfast love, O Lord, held me up when I thought all was lost and I can't persevere any further. The cares of my heart are many. When the cares of my heart are many, and he is saying they were many, and you can see why in this earlier description of the powers of chaos and evil. When the cares of my heart are many, your consolations cheer my soul. So the psalmist here is offering himself to the community as an example of what they should do. They may be in despair. Their foot may be slipping. The cares and burdens that they carry may be too many. They may feel that they should despair and that all is lost. But at that very moment, they are encouraged by the example of the psalmist to turn to the steadfast love of God, to rely on the one whose consolations are able to cheer their soul. And so he's urging them, the community for whom he's writing this psalm by his own example, he's encouraging them that they too might turn to the Lord. And to know that, verses 20 and 21, that wicked rulers cannot be a part of what God is doing. Those who contrive mischief by statute, who make unjust laws. We see that in our own time. Not only have there been wicked rulers, human rulers who have done what is wrong, but laws have been passed, even by legitimate assemblies, that are against the will of God. And so they have put into practice in law what is the psalmist considers to be harm and mischief. They band together, these wicked rulers, against the life of the righteous and condemn the innocent to death. And so this is a part of his critique that we mentioned in verses 4 through 7 of what the wicked do, and should be added, I think, to the list of things that the psalmist sees as wrong in the world, in addition to what is said in verses 4 through 7. But the psalm ends with the encouragement that despite these powers of chaos that threaten the reign and rule of God as king, despite the powers of chaos, God is called upon to rise up and judge the earth, verse 2, and that the people of God can take comfort and solace in the fact that the Lord has become their stronghold. Again, the psalmist offers his own experience here at the end of this psalm. The Lord has become my stronghold in the midst of this time of trouble, and my God is my rock of refuge. He's urging the community to do the same, to take refuge in God when the powers of evil arise. There is a promise here that in the end, injustice won't win. From the psalm, "This is my Father's world," we have the line, "Though the wrong seems off so strong, God is the ruler yet." And that's the message of Psalms 93 and 94. That though the wrong seems off so strong, described in Psalm 93 by the flood powers of chaos, described in Psalm 94 by verses 4 through 7 and 20 and 21, in which all justice is being threatened by these evildoers in society. And yet the psalmist says God will repay them for their iniquity and will wipe them out for their wickedness, for the Lord our God will wipe them out. We just don't know when. And so in the interim, in the meantime, between the promise and its ultimate fulfillment, there are chaotic powers that threaten all that is good. And the psalmist asks God to take vengeance, to restore justice, but he also encourages the people to take hope that they who live in such a time might know that God will act on their behalf, God will dig a pit for the wicked, God will execute justice against all the powers of evil that harm human beings, that harm the created world, and that the Lord our God will destroy all that which stands against the goodness and compassion of his kingdom. And I think that's the overall message of Psalms 93 and 94. Upcoming are two psalms that are highly celebrative of God. They're psalms of praise and thanks that are sung and spoken in many churches still, even today, thousands of years later from the time they were originally written. So we'll look forward to studying Psalms 95 and 96 next time. That would be on August the 28th. And then we'll take a break on Labor Day. After the 28th, that's next Monday, there will not be study questions on the 29th or 30th. I will not send out study questions because the Monday study group will not meet on September 5th, on Labor Day. It will not meet in person, and there will be no video that day. We are traveling, we have family in town, and we plan to be participating with them in their activities, and we'll be gone from our home here in Oak Harbor and be in Seattle and Tacoma with visiting family who are coming for my grandson Sam's soccer matches being held in Tacoma, I think at Pacific Lutheran. So we're okay for next week. I'll send out study questions probably tomorrow on Psalms 95 and 96. And then we'll have a regular video and in-person discussion next Monday on August 29th, on Monday the 29th. And then after that, we're taking a 1-week break. And after Labor Day, then I'll send out new study questions on the, what would that be, the 6th, I think, of September. And we'll then resume the video as well as in-person discussion on the 2nd Monday of September. That's the plan. Take care. God bless and be with you. The Lord reigns. Amen.